It was the first time in 25 years that people who live in the capital's slums hit the streets to protest against Chavismo, the ideology behind the leftist government that have ruled Venezuela for decades. It caught both the government and the opposition by surprise. Less than 24 hours after Nicolás Maduro claimed victory in the elections, residents of the poorest neighborhoods in Caracas took to the streets, some banging pots and pans, all of them outraged by an election that the opposition claims was rigged.
We are here because of the electoral fraud, the deceit committed against the people of Venezuela. We are now tired of being oppressed in this country, which is so beautiful, so wonderful.
Soon, a crowd began walking toward the city center. They came from the many barrios or neighborhoods of Petare, a group of slums in Caracas with about 400,000 inhabitants. They were stopped by the security forces with violence, and they fought back while they could. Thus began a week of brutal repression, which by Wednesday left more than 20 dead and about 2,000 people in prison. The repression targeted the poorest segments of the population, those who had been the base of support for Chavismo for 2.5 decades, and who were now calling for a change in the streets of Venezuela. Now, many are missing, and their families search for answers.
They gave me some information on what they're accusing him of and why. I mean, why don't they tell me anything about him? And I go and ask, and they still don't tell me anything.
Hernan Garcia is looking for his son. At the doors of the detention centers in Caracas, hundreds like him were looking for information about their missing relatives. Almost all of them were people from poor neighborhoods. There was hardly anyone from the traditional Chavista opposition in Venezuela, almost always middle class, almost always well-educated. Maduro's forces have targeted the poor population to prevent the slums from continuing to rise in protest. Both the government and the opposition agree that only the poorest communities could be capable of destabilizing the government. They were the most loyal until last week. The response has been harsh against those who dare to protest in the heart of Chavismo.
We know they're being presented in terrorism courts, and one of the crimes they're being charged with is terrorism. It's a very serious offense since the penalty involves 30 years in prison just for the crime of terrorism. In other words, it's the maximum penalty we have in Venezuela.
Maduro promises no forgiveness and harsh penalties for those he labels as terrorists. Among the penalties, he suggests, will be forced labor. In the past, the threats have worked. In the previous opposition demonstrations, the people of the poor neighborhoods did not join the protests. Back then, they were led by Venezuela's more comfortable classes. The events of last week show the battle lines for Maduro are shifting. VOANews, Caracas.